Lawyers who put together wills, what is the craziest, oddest thing someone wanted to put in theirs? This one isn't necessarily crazy, just an interesting glimpse into the mind of a kind old woman in her 90s. My aunt and uncle, both were more like parents and incredibly beautiful people, passed away within a few weeks of one another. When my uncle became ill, the aunt tried to work on a will with her long-term lawyer, but she was kind of just old and out of it. Her main concern the entire time was small knickknacks like a jar of pennies she wanted a distant cousin to have, or a used jacket from the 70s she left to a sister-in-law. It was quite touching how much time she spent carefully considering each item and who would get what. Most of the items were used and didn't even really hold any sentimental value. She just wanted them to go to good homes. When she passed away, everyone knew exactly who was getting each odd item. The real kicker is when the lawyer told the primary beneficiaries that she never got around to the bigger assets and all that jazz. She basically told the lawyer, quote, pay for our funeral and anything we owe, and then family members X, Y, and Z can figure out the rest. It ended up being millions in homes, lakefront property, jewelry, antique, firearms, vehicles, life insurance policies, stocks, bonds, gold coins, etc., etc. Luckily, the family is very close and everything went off without a hitch. They were amazing people who wanted to keep family items in the family. They just didn't put that much weight on their incredible wealth. They also hid their wealth amazingly. We all knew they were very comfortable, but no one had any idea they were deep into 8-figure assets. It was just funny to see a random niece get a set of plastic cups, worn dance shoes, and a check for $125,000. It's wonderful to see a sizable estate shared among heirs in a loving way with nobody arguing over money or stuff, right? We don't need any more of those kinds of stories. Story 2. I read a lot of estate documents as part of my job. There's so much subtle shade in them occasionally, they can be pretty entertaining. One super wealthy lady had a huge section for the care and well-being of her pets with primary and successor caretakers. A certain amount of money from the trust for care and feeding of each pet. One pet owner might receive $3,000 a month to take care of one of her pets after she passed, and certain stipulations on how they were to be cared for. While some might see it as excessive, the language and stipulations she had and how they were referred to showed that she really, really loved her pets. In that same will and trust, she also left a slew of people only $1, so that there would be no chance they could take the trust to probate court on the basis that they were merely forgotten. That part had so much subtle shade. A lot of, they know what they did, they were well aware of their guilt in the matter, etc. She split up about $2 million among 5 or 6 different animal rescues and animal welfare charities. It was around 200 pages long, and I swear I read the entire thing just for the sheer entertainment value. Story 3. My own grandmother specified which of the children and grandchildren should get which of the family recipes, and somehow felt the need to include commentary about why certain decisions were made. One recipe was this Prohibition-era recipe for beer, which I knew my uncle, also a home brewer, wanted, but she left it to me with the comment that, I know you wanted it, Teddy, but she has the second best penmanship of the girls and will make you a copy. And then like 8 pages later, in among the specific descriptions of her vast collection of romance novels, really, was a line, quote, and specific Drew Devereaux title to Spidey, who will please subtract about half the hops before she copies a recipe for her Uncle Teddy, so that any of us can drink it. Our John had his IPA last summer and just about passed, unquote. Uncle John just about burst into tears laughing, and Uncle Teddy had long since left the room because he has no care whatsoever to give about romance novels. Uncle John, of course, was still in the room because there was also still Yung Ling. And no, I have no idea how she got this will done. My guess is she wrote it herself, and the law students who came to her independent living building signed off on it. It was elaborate, that's for sure. Total value of the estate was well under $8,000, so it was mostly a funny last letter from Grandma. Story 4. My grandfather and his law partner opened a small law firm out of a broom closet in a small Midwestern town in the 50s. Most of their cases were wills and contracts, small town stuff. His very first client was an old farmer who wanted his will made that left, among other things, a taxidermy dog to his only son. By the mid-60s, the firm was rapidly outgrowing their tiny office. A local lawyer passed away suddenly, leaving his office on the town square up for grabs. They took it sight unseen. My granddad and his partner got an awesome lease on a huge law office suite on the town square, 30 yards from the courthouse. The first client guy passed away the very day they got the keys to the new office. His son was the first client at the new office. He came in with the taxidermy dog while they were literally moving boxes. He dealt with his father's estate and planned his own estate. And then he asked my granddad to store the taxidermy dog for a week while he fumigated. My grandfather agreed to put the dog into an unused office, and the guy went on his way. When my granddad moved the dog into an upstairs office, he found a locked wall safe that hadn't been mentioned in the lease. The property owner had no idea it was even there, let alone the combination, and told my granddad he could have whatever he found. My granddad called his best buddies, a couple of young lawyers, doctors, a realtor, and the local mortician to come help him open the safe. They tried to open the safe, even using one of the doctor's stethoscopes. Much to their chagrin, they failed miserably. Feeling defeated, they finally called the local locksmith, who managed to get it unlocked. They paid the locksmith before he looked inside, not knowing what sensitive material they might have found. And that was a good call. There was no money, but they found a mason jar full of and a couple of quarts of moonshine. It all magically disappeared, and by complete coincidence, the parties they threw were the stuff of small-town legends. The guy came back for the dog a week later. My grandfather told him that he thought the dog was a lucky charm. The guy redid his will a few years later and left the taxidermy dog to the firm. It was still there when I was a little girl in the 80s. Every time my granddad would bring me to the office, I would pet it the whole time. Wow, so this story has the makings of like a pretty good Hollywood movie. Just have it star Brad Pitt and who else? Story 5. My dad told me about this when my grandpa set up his will. Basically, he first wanted to discuss the who gets what with his family first before putting it into writing. Smart, because that can open a lot of issues later on. So my grandpa is sitting down with his 2 sons discussing who gets what, and my mother and my aunt are there, and they're having a lot of ideas on how to split everything, whether item A is equal to monetary value B, and most importantly, what their respective part of the family could do with what item or possession. At some point, my grandpa had enough. He told the wives to leave the room because, hey, quit arguing about my stuff and money like that. I'm not gone yet. But the most poignant thing he said was that he was dividing his earthly possession up between his sons. Not their wives, not his grandchildren. He had 2 sons and they would get the lion's share. There were provisions in there for individual items that he would ask people about. Do you want this? Would that thing make you happy? Could you use X? And he put aside certain monies to be divided up between the grandchildren, cousins, etc. But he was very firm on who gets what, and he communicated it very clearly. This is my stuff, I decide, and the only input I value is by the 2 people I've known all their lives. Well, he passed away and everyone was informed and knew what to expect. My grandma is still alive. Years ago, around the same time that the will was being drafted, she decided that most of her valuable possessions should be similarly taken care of. She labeled all her jewelry, put them in those little plastic bags that you freeze stuff in, because the bags my grandma uses for that have little labels on them that you can write on. Made the whole thing easy. And then she eventually decided, why wait, and distributed them as gifts. She was getting up there, and she pretty much never had an occasion to wear jewelry anymore except for 1 or 2 beloved items. I feel that there is an important lesson here. Deal with this kind of stuff early, communicate clearly, preferably when everyone involved is actually there, and then live. Everyone witnesses it and can't deny it later. Not that there was any danger of that happening in my family, I think. But I guess my grandparents knew. Inheritance and money in general can rip families apart. And if you want to curb that risk, no matter how insignificant it may seem, you gotta address the problem head on. You cannot hide from the problems caused by your ending, just like you can't hide from the reaper. Peace of mind and a family not at risk of engaging in litigation against each other is worth some time and effort. Story 6. Not a lawyer, but my job has me reading a lot of wills, and I have a great one that actually led to law changes in my country. About 25 years ago, the government started working on a centralized digital land register. One of the companies that got the contracts, split by areas, was ours. A little simplified background on the process. Citizens bring their contracts, which include wills or any other titles they have to prove ownership. We read them, document, work on them, create the maps, and solve disputes. We post the maps online. Citizens are allowed to post objections and go to trials for ownership if there are still disputes. They are also allowed to make new claims with a fee. When we post the maps tied with contracts and ownerships online, there are always lots, fields, etc. that are empty, given to unknown because their ownership is long forgotten. So now to the will. After they posted maps on a rural area, there comes a guy that said he found his aunt's lost will, and the will goes like this. I, name redacted, am writing my last will. I want my son, name redacted, to take my field in location X of size 500 meters squared. I want my daughter, name redacted, to take my 50 meters squared house in the village, and my beloved nephew, name redacted, that I adore will be the new owner of my fields in locations Y with a size Z, total of 20 fields of accumulated size 50,000 meters squared. Signature X because I don't know how to read and write. The will was handwritten. It was an obvious scam trying to gain ownership of 20 lots with unknown ownership. Ever since, the laws were quickly changed to make it harder for people to pull off such scams. Story 7. My grandmother owns a large farm that is to be sold on her passing with the money divided in a predetermined way between all her children and grandchildren. Well, this guy suddenly married my mother after she got cancer. They were dating prior, but once she got cancer, they were married within a year. When the guy was out at my grandma's, he was asking about property lines and such, and my grandma realized he was trying to seize my mom's inheritance. My grandma surmised that on my mom's passing, she would request that her inheritance go to the new husband, and my grandma couldn't refuse her last wish. So she changed her will to say that if my mom passed before my grandma, my mother's inheritance would become $1, and me and my brother's inheritance would increase my difference. That way, she could say, yes, your inheritance goes to your husband, and when she passed, he would get $1. Everyone is still alive now, and she survived cancer. There are rumors the marriage isn't going so well, which increases everyone's suspicion he was hoping for her to pass and collect a windfall. Story 8. Lawyer here, but I can't think of a client as strange as my own grandmother. She passed away well after my grandfather and had pretty good nursing home bills, not Medicare eligible because of the estate and her absolute refusal to engage in spending down. So her estate was mainly personal belongings, a $750,000 house, a $25,000 to $50,000 debt, and less than $50,000 in stocks, bonds, savings, etc. Her will involved individual cash amounts to grandkids, remainder to her 3 sons. But there were also 3 specific bequests. Her engagement ring went to my sister, her grandfather's clock went to my cousin, and the wicker furniture from the porch on the house went to her nephew. Never seen furniture of nominal value in an estate. Side note, because of the debt and the taxes associated with the house, as well as the 3 brothers not living near the house was sold. The remaining money was divided according to her amounts, but there wasn't actually enough money to cover the cash payments, so everyone got a ratio. To my cousin, who has always been the favorite, it was supposed to be $50,000. To the majority of the rest of us, it was supposed to be $10,000. A few great-grandchildren were alive long enough to make the will, so they got $1,000 each, I think. But she cannot divide her cash of $50,000 between 10 people when one is supposed to get $50,000. I think I got $1,800 or $800 when everything was said and done. The favorite got exactly 5 times that amount. But her sons got about $225,000 each, and I guarantee you, if she knew the outcome, 1, she would have done a spend, and 2, she would have specifically bequeathed the house to the grandkids and the money to her sons. But that furniture is still going strong. Story 9. My ex-husband's grandma had a quite extensive Department 56 collection. It's a brand from, the last I heard, Hallmark. They make those Christmas village houses. Of course, each piece has a limited number of pieces, and each one is collectible, blah, blah, blah. So she passed away, and in her will, there were very specific instructions as to who got what piece, but only for a handful of pieces. X was awarded the majority of the pieces since he would go shopping with her when he was young, and they'd pick them out together, etc. Well, to the rest of the family, it was akin to a fight, and for the remaining pieces, we were talking like 100+ pieces, they put them in the middle of a room and drew numbers for pecking order and went as many rounds as it took for the pieces to get divided up. And for years, I'm not kidding, there were grumblings if Cousin X hosted Christmas Eve and, quote, didn't even put out the Victorian train station, so disrespectful. Yeah, glad to not be a part of that anymore. Story 10. My grandfather was great. He was widowed for a few years before remarrying. His new wife, N.W., constantly commented to his children, my mom and uncle, that the house would be theirs someday. She wasn't making any claim, and her children weren't either. It was also her second marriage. But would always make sure we knew at any time she spent any of her money on home maintenance. After 10 years, we all resigned ourselves to expect she'd get everything. They spent a little over 20 happy years together, and I loved her like she was my grandma. But when he passed away, fireworks. Lord, I wish I'd been there when they read his will because it turned out he pulled a Swiftie and left her pretty much nothing. She got the bank account, the sale of his car, and to stay in the house as long as she wanted. Jaws dropped. She questioned it. Years earlier, they'd redone their wills and made them reciprocate, or so she thought. Hers was changed. The date on his matched the date on hers, but not the contents. Guess he always knew once he was gone, so was his legacy to his children. Sneaky old bugger. Story 11. Not a lawyer, but have a story nonetheless. My grandmother passed and left all her estate to her 4 grandchildren, that being myself and my 3 siblings. My mother was specifically outed of everything because my grandmother thought that my mother is a genuinely evil person. She was right. even going as far as making it so each of our parts were only accessible after we each turned 25, so that my mother couldn't manipulate the money out of young, impressionable children. My mother still tried hard, though. She contested the will and stole a bunch of stuff from my grandmother's home in the days after her passing, before her assets could be counted and gathered. This included jewelry, a television, multiple bits and pieces, basically anything that could fit into my grandmother's car, of which my mother also stole. The executor tried very hard over the next couple of years to pursue legal action to have the belongings returned to the estate so they could be added to our portions, but my mother played mental mind games and lied a lot, made the poor executor's life a living nightmare to the point where she ended up giving in due to the high level of stress the whole situation was putting on her and her family. My mother then went on to use the stolen belongings to sell and put toward a house deposit, which she claims is going to end up going to you kids when I passed away anyway, so fair is fair. Story 12. I set up a trust where the primary beneficiary was the client's dogs. Person was single, late 20s, no spouse or kids, but owned several dogs and helped run fundraisers for dog shelters all the time. The trust was set up to first benefit the person's pets they owned at the time of passing, with a guardian and caretaker and alternate's name for the pets upon passing, and instructions given to the trustee to reimburse any of the guardian's expenses for pet care and food, shelter, toys, vet care, etc. for the animals. Only after all the animals had passed away was any leftover money to go to the family, parents and siblings in this case. I thought it was pretty awesome that this person thought so much about the care of their pets after passing. Even if your animals aren't your primary beneficiary, if you're doing estate planning with an attorney anyway, go ahead and add a few lines and name a guardian for your pets in a will and trust, and maybe set some money aside for your pets to provide for their care. Story 13. Not a lawyer, but worked for an auction company who deals with a lot of probate deals. This was a flat-out hoarder's house, absolutely dirty and full of trash. The owners left their belongings to be auctioned off then and wanted the money to go to the cat and for it to be taken care of. Well, apparently nobody was aware of the final wishes. The cat was put down. The contents were originally appraised at $10,000 for all of the things of value in the house. We went in expecting it to be a quick inventory process, basically a room, a lot meaning items or items for sale together. There were only supposed to be maybe like 10 lots. We showed up expecting to be done in an hour. We opened one bedroom door and the whole room was piled to the ceiling in boxes. Opened one box and it was all old newspapers, so just trash. Opened the next box and it was full of original Kenner Star Wars toys in their original boxes. At that point, we decided everything needed to be gone through. We spent a lot of time in this dirty house. We dedicated one bedroom to just original Kenner Star Wars toys. Found over 100 pounds of silver coins throughout the house. There was just so much stuff. It went from a quick $10,000 auction to a long sorting and inventorying process. The final hammer ended up over $150,000 that was donated to different charities and shelters since the cat was no longer alive. Also, a very eerie house. The husband was hospitalized and passed away. The wife only lived about a week after her husband's passing. She left a note on the back of the master bedroom door. I do not remember the exact wording, but it said something along the lines of, "Without you, there was no light or meaning to life. I love you." Story 14. Not a lawyer, and before I go down the story, I'll say up front that I'm not hurt that my in-laws didn't get changed after I married my wife. My in-laws never really liked my wife's brother's wife. They also didn't really like my wife's previous husband, so in their will, it was stated specifically that the spouses get nothing once both my MIL and FIL passed away. A 50-50 split to my wife and her brother. Each surviving child would take a split of that, so it was really 25% to my wife, 25% to my brother-in-law, with 12.5% to my two kids and 8.3% to each of his three. There's all kinds of wording in there that spouses don't get jack. If my brother passes before getting his full dispersal, the money goes to his kids and the same for my wife. Everything is held in trust to keep my SIL and my wife's first husband from getting anything. I love my in-laws and they love me, but I'm not hurt by this because I had a really bad experience with inheritance when my uncle passed and saw what it did to my mother's family. I found it more humorous than anything that my SIL read written out so vehemently. Now, if you're enjoying the video or connecting to any one of these stories, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 15. There's currently arguments in my family on my mother's side. My mother is one of 4 kids, and she is the only one who visits my grandpa. He moved away when I was young. We see him every year. He told mom that the only one in the will is mom and my mom's family. Mom said she didn't want his money or his home. We already had the pieces we valued the most. Years before, gave me and my sister bracelets that he made for his wife, one for her 18th birthday and one for her 21st birthday. She passed before I was born, and these items mean the world to me and my sister. Mom told him if he wanted to leave anything, to leave it to the people who are with him daily, as they are his family too. My mom's sister, who doesn't leave the house ever, phoned him to ask about his will. He said he wasn't leaving it to anyone, as Mom had turned it down, and he didn't like the other three, as they were money-grabbing leeches. Ever since that day, said sister had phoned Mom every day, demanding she tell him to give her everything in the will, or she was going to end herself in front of her kids. Mom had no sympathy and told her to do it then. 8 years later, she's still threatening Mom, and Grandpa has completely blocked any communication from her and her brothers. So still, Mom is the only one who sees him. I'm glad I was born on the good side of the family tree. LOL. Story 16. Not a lawyer, but I had to post this. My father, well, he was a schmuck and had a second family. He treated them like gold while mistreating my brother and I. My brother turned into a bad man. I turned out kinda okay compared to him, but I'm pretty scarred and messed up thanks to Dad. He used to have me search through my mom's papers in order to totally mess her over in divorce court. He had lots of money, she had nothing. He won, basically. When I was old enough, I realized what he'd been making me do and told him I couldn't do it anymore. So he stopped talking to me for 20 years. When I found out he was on his last days, I spent $3,000, almost all the money I had, to visit him so I could clear it up so he could end having had that issue addressed and me tell him I love him. 3 weeks later, he passed. When the will came, not only were my brother and I not left anything and everything left to his second wife and daughter, but I actually got on page 1, paragraph 3 that no matter what, I was not to receive one bit of his rather large estate. It went into detail about all the ways his stuff and money could come into my hands, gifting, all benefactory, etc. in detail. Thanks, Dad. I guess Family Feud was an actual game in their household. Story 17. I'm not a lawyer, but I was possibly one of those people that made an odd request. In my will, I instructed the executor of my state to pursue a wrongful passing suit against anyone involved in my passing, including but especially the police and other authorities. I also took out a life insurance policy to fund the lawsuit in the event of my passing. The extra segments of the will are of course only enacted if my passing is not of natural causes, which is to be determined only after a third-party investigation to preclude poisoning or other means of foul play. Termination while in jail also enacts the will as intended, as well as still being guaranteed the insurance funding. However, in the case of a natural passing, or if the settlements are one in excess of the expenses necessary to win, since I have no inheritors, the life insurance policy and settlement will be bequeathed to an orphan's charity. Since having myself personally grow up as an orphan, I know the struggle of young people without people to protect them will experience. I call it my nuclear option, MAD, and I had it written to dissuade others from causing my premature passing. I also have a confession tape recording my executors supposed to handle according to a set of circumstances outlined in my will. Story 18. My great-grandmother, who passed in her 90s, left a good amount of money to her church. She also left a small rental property she owned to the guy who lived there, who also drove her to her doctor's appointments, church, etc. She had 2 living children at the time and one that had passed earlier but had 2 children, my mother and uncle. All of my great-grandmother's items were sold at auction: furniture, handmade quilts, jewelry, house, car, everything. If you want a particular piece of furniture, go to the auction and buy it. Like that quilt that Ma Susie made? Up for auction. There were her 2 kids bidding on the same piece of furniture and against other buyers. Grandchildren and cousins the same. My mom bought 2 to 3 pieces of furniture because my great-grandmother had made the remark she wanted my grandmother, who had passed prior, to have that piece. The money from the auction was to be split 3 ways: 1 to my great-aunt, 1 to my great-uncle, and 1 to my grandmother. My grandmother's share was to be divided between my mother and my uncle. If my grandmother had outlived my great-grandmother, everything was divided up evenly, but when my grandmother passed, my great-grandmother rewrote everything. And now that I look back on it, it seems pretty logical, albeit aggravating. Story 19. Side note here from Europe. Here, there is legislation in place to prevent parents from giving everything to charity. Children and spouses are allocated a minimum legal share, which is half of their share if there was no will. So, say you have 1 kid and 1 spouse and leave no will. They get everything 50-50 by law. If you leave a will, they are entitled by law to half of that. So, by making your will, you can't bar your kid from 25% of your fortune unless you officially disinherit him for very specific reasons recognized by the law. And if you passed away and you've left less to your kids or spouse than is their legal minimum share, they can dispute the allocation. So, if you gave it all to charity, that charity will only get what's left after the family gets their shares, if there's anything left. The American system is just strange to me as a lawyer. Story 20. My grandfather has specifically required me to make my mother and aunt sell his vases for no less than 75% of their value. They are about $400 each, and he has at least 15 of them. They are clay vases made by some artist in North Carolina that he and my step-grandmother are very fond of. Another one related to my grandfather. My great-grandfather passed away before my great-grandmother. His ashes stayed with her until her passing. When my great-grandmother passed away in the 90s, my grandfather and my great-uncle took part of the estate money, which was now theirs, and flew first class on the Concorde jet, a supersonic passenger jet, to France to spread my great-grandfather's ashes in the sign. My grandfather is getting older and older, and he keeps telling me the story. I think he is proud to say, get stuff to the French police by spreading ashes in. He was born in France in December of 1940. Also, my step-grandmother always mentions that it was a boys' trip. I guess my great-uncle's wife was very controlling and a planner, and they politely, or not, I don't really know, told her to screw off. My great-uncle was apparently something of a ladies' man in his 20s and early 30s, so I like to imagine the trip as some low-key bachelor party. Story 21. My dad, who oddly enough passed away yesterday, 3 years ago on Australia Day, de facto a crazy Norwegian woman who I can only describe as the evil stepmother and I, Cinderella. 20 years I tried with this woman. I tried as much as I could, but nothing was good enough. She'd call my mother telling her how much of an awful son I was. I also cared for my dad for 2 years before he passed away of cancer. I had a great relationship with my dad. He arrived in Australia from Denmark on boat. Took 3 months, nearly 50 years ago. And people still ask me, how long has your father been in Australia for? LOL, Dad's accent was still so strong even after 50 years. Anyway, my brother and I knew we'd never be given a will for Dad, and he'd never write one because he had no money. So that was that, and of course, crazy lady, we would never expect anything from her, ever. Side note, both of her sons aged in their late 30s when I was in my early 20s, unfortunately ended it all 1 year after the other. Which is very sad, but because she was so nasty and horrible, all her family had completely cut her off, so she then had no one except my dad. I knew her parents had money. The family name is well known in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, but again, I didn't even think twice because I was adamant she'd give everything to a waste recycling place up the road or ship it back to Norway. Also, as my dad was getting worse, I thought he would go first. I used to have panic attacks thinking of her trying to deuce things around with his funeral. Even though they were in a de facto relationship for 15 years, Dad actually lived across the road because he could watch the soccer in peace. She nagged and screamed at him, so he'd tell her politely, please, get off. Always please, always polite. She would call the police for mistreatment. And saying that the giant corner block that she owned outright, Dad was renting, also had a shop down the bottom and she sold mostly secondhand crap, but she also knew her antiques very well. When she would go back to see her one friend in Norway at Christmas, she would ask Dad to look after the shop. Towards the end, he could barely walk, so I told him just to say yes, and I would sit him there so he could watch, but I'd do the hustle. He liked that the most. I definitely got my sales and personal skills from my dad, bit of a Viking gypsy, and thank God I got my Cinderella looks from my mom. We'd only opened the shop for maybe 3 days. The rest of those glorious, crazy lady-free days we just got to spend together, him and me. Then we got the phone call just before Christmas. It was her one friend, crying, screaming into the mobile. Apparently, she hadn't listened to her friend regarding the recent freezing of the ice on the roads, and she didn't do a special thing to her tires. Dad and I were in total shock, but more so, she was like a cat but with unlimited lives instead of 9. He did have to deal with her daily for 15 years. I took him back across the road to his place and put him to bed. In the dark, holding my breath, I was already on my way back to her house. I could have let my brother or dad know what I was doing. They love to gossip more than 2 85-year-old women. They would have easily let it slip. So I called a friend, told him to go buy another phone, a SIM card, and call me back. Don't ask questions. You and your dad will both get $5,000 cash. Not saying this is a cultural thing, but when you say that to an Arab, things get done and things get done fast. He called back and it was 11 p.m. I told him I needed both his and his father's help. I also needed their removal truck and I needed it now, please. Again, no questions. They were there within 25 minutes, lights off, engine off, back up, rolled that truck towards the rear garage. She thought I knew nothing about her family's history, or what an antique even was. But I had 2 years caring for my dad to watch, learn, and study. I knew how much nearly every single item in her house was worth dollar-wise. Not her bedroom, though. I do have some respect. So with the lights low and absolutely no speaking, I started pointing at things, and one by one they were quietly loaded onto the truck. While father and son were busy packing my inheritance, I went to her bedroom upstairs. I was never even allowed to go upstairs, not even to quickly use the bathroom. It was weird actually, as I'd never seen it before. Being Norwegian, I just thought it would be a big, giant white box. I wasn't far off. Obviously, I grabbed her jewelry box first and looked in all the secret places one would hide things. Yes, I even looked in her freezer, lol. But while I was looking, I stumbled across this bunch of papers in a plastic bag. It was her will. I thought, well, it doesn't matter because I'm gifting myself and my brother about 7 to 800K for 15 years of pain and suffering, and knowing for a fact my brother and I would get zilch. Then I thought, what if she left Dad out of her will? You see, I always thought he would pass away first, not her, so I hadn't thought or planned for it. Okay, fine, quick then, just read the will and fast. There was no rude shock, really. She had specifically written in her will that my dad was to receive from her estate a $40 blue vase. That was it. The rest of her estate, etc., was to be put into a Norwegian trust fund for her two nieces, who she never had met, and they could only access the money when they turned 27. The niece's mother and crazy lady's only sibling, sister in Norway, was extremely kind but crazy hated her. Her sister also got a $40 blue vase. As she would have no idea about the events that would unfold, she had clumsily left a ton of notes with dates, times, and questions for herself and for her lawyer. I could also see questions she had written in previous meetings with him dating back to over a year, and she would see the lawyer easily once a week, no less than 20 to 30 questions with long written explanations underneath each one. It also randomly included the deeds for her house. Yes, I was very tempted, trust me, as there was at least one full page written entirely on my faults. She was trying to have the last word, well, so she thought. I went downstairs, did a quick itinerary check, no questions from them still, nothing, lol. I handed my friend and his dad her jewelry box, no idea what was inside, it's also never been discussed. I then handed his father a set of keys to a 1959 BMW 507 Classic, which her father had brought over when they immigrated to Australia from Norway. I told my friend to drive the truck alone and park it in their factory and that his dad would follow him home in his new car. I knew they didn't have a lot of money, so to see his dad's face confused, then shocked, and then cry made it all worth it. I believe those kinds of BMWs are worth anywhere between $2.5 to $5 million now. After the BMW 507 quietly rolled out with lights off and a big grin and wave, I could now read from the lawyer's notes and her own see she had intended to meet with him a day after she returned back to Sydney. She had already signed her will, no date, he hadn't. I sat down on a cheap stool, once where $8,000 original Danish lounges and Danish rose oak $3,000 antique desks used to be, and poured a cognac. Hate cognac, trying to be all fancy, lol. I wrote my father back into her will, not for her money, but so at least he could live out the rest of his days peacefully in her house without fear of being kicked out at any given moment. I also made provisions for her estate to pay an allowance to my father $1,000 a week, but the conditions were the money was to be given to him in $200 lots only by my brother. They didn't have the greatest friendship. I wanted and forced them to bond. Remember the good times and laugh. I changed my dad's blue $40 vase name to my brother's name and her sister's $40 blue vase to my name. Then I addressed her sister directly and apologized for all the mean and cold-hearted things I had done, that I carried that guilt and bided with me all my life, and I was so sorry. I changed the wording to say as soon as my father had peacefully passed and funeral arrangements had been taken care of, that the trustee, the lawyer, pay 100% of the remaining estate, stocks, life insurance, and some weird Norwegian pension set up to one beneficiary, and one beneficiary only. Quote, my beautiful, loving sister, XX. The total sum, I believe, was somewhere in the vicinity of $148 million. And that was pretty much that. Due to the extensive notes left for me and 2 years of studying and learning, everything went to plan. I told my brother I found money in her freezer when cleaning a few days later. Scandinavians are a bit odd like that. So he didn't question it, especially when I told him he would be getting $398,000 cash. I walked away with a bit less than that, but when I left that night, I left with her prized Aston Martin, which I quietly sold later that week for $285K. I also walked away with a big smile on my face. I got the last word. Miss you, Dad. Story 22. My aunt had my grandfather sell her their $1 million estate to her for $1 for tax purposes. When she found out the house was split 3 ways between her, my dad, and my uncle, despite the will saying the house can't be sold without all of them there. My aunt also wrote the entire will because my grandfather is from Italy and never really learned how to read English very well, and she ends up leaving everything to herself except some money my gramp saved unless no one noticed. None of us grandkids got anything except my aunt's daughter who was next in line for the house. When my brother, dad, and uncle flew from Florida to New York for the funeral, my brother was the only one without a suit. So my aunt decided that they all needed matching suits. They declined, but she persisted, stating she'd pay for them and the plane tickets, and didn't tell them about the will until after the funeral, until after they returned to Florida. She didn't even mention the money portion of the inheritance until my dad found out from the accountant how much there was. They were each supposed to get around $12,000 each, but my dad and my uncle were missing about $3,000, which my aunt said was for the suits and tickets. As for the house, my dad begged and pleaded with her to put their names on the deed since he helped build the house with his bare hands. My uncle and grandfather as well, while my aunt was nowhere to be seen during the whole building process, but she adamantly denied doing so, saying she was afraid they'd sell it out from under her, and that she deserved it because she lived with them her whole life, no lie, and helped them when they were sick, despite there being a clause not allowing that. By the way, my grandparents took care of each other until my grandma passed. Then my grandpa lived the rest of his life a coherent, funny, loving man. My mom thinks it's because my dad and uncle were big brothers and they teased her a lot when she was little, like very little, and they treated her much better over the years. I'm named after a drink, for God's sake. She's just a spiteful, greedy witch who just lost her whole family. My dad sent letters to everyone in our family, including the ones she visits regularly in Italy, explaining in great detail what my aunt did. In the end, she wound up with $1 million+ estate, $92,000 in estate keep-up money, everything inside the house that belonged to my grandparents, and almost made away with the inheritance from my dad and uncle. I guess there's always one evil, terrible, greedy, bad grape in the bunch. Story 23. There was this one woman who got mistreated by her husband while she was pregnant. She got brought to the hospital as quickly as possible, but unfortunately she was passing and it seems like she knew before we even told her. All she wanted was that she could give birth to save at least her posterity. We were scared she would pass away soon after giving birth or even while she was doing so we asked her if she had any last words, any will to leave behind. She was so weakened that she couldn't understand properly what she said, as it seemed that she tried to say that she already had a will but that it was lost. Then she couldn't talk as she gave birth in extreme pain to her twins, and she finally said that she lost the will to live. Unknowing what to do, we brought one of the twins to her parents and the other one to some kind of strange farmers in a desert so that her husband can't go after them. Only time will tell how that story will unfold, though. And if you're not willing to wait for that story unfolding and you like these stories, here's more for you right now. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for hanging with me on this one.